Hi, everybody. Welcome to Literature Out Loud, and thanks again for Thunder River Theater's sponsoring us. Today's program features the writings of Nathan Englander, who is a very wonderful and current author that I was not familiar with, and now I am. Let me think of what I can tell you about Nathan Englander. He has been nominated and won almost every literary prize there is for short story writing. And he has been making some of his short stories recently into scripts to be performed. He studied script writing under Nora Ephron, and we featured her work last month. The newest piece that he did was commissioned by Lincoln Center and was supposed to be performed at the Old Globe in San Diego right now, but we have this virus thing going on, so it is postponed. But it is titled the same thing as the book that these short stories are from, What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, which was inspired by the great story by Raymond Carver, which is what we talk about when we talk about love. The guy is an unbelievable writer. We have two of the finest readers I know of in the world, not just the Roaring Fork Valley. We have Lee Sullivan, who will be reading Free Fruit for Young Widows, and Mo LeMay, who will be reading The Reader. Both excellent people, both my friends, and both people that you will come away appreciating. Lee, would you honor us first, please, with your story? Thank you.
I'm reading Free Fruit for Young Widows from What We Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank, Nathan Englander. When the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser took control of the Suez Canal, threatening Western access to that vital route, an agitated France shifted allegiances, joining forces with Britain and Israel against Egypt. This is a fact neither here nor there, except that during the 1956 Sinai campaign, there were soldiers in the Israeli army and soldiers in the Egyptian army who ended up wearing identical French-supplied uniforms in battle. Well, not long into the fighting, an Israeli platoon came to rest at a captured Egyptian camp to the east of Bergavgafa in the Sinai Desert. There, Private Shimi Gezer, formerly Simon Biberblatt of Warsaw, Poland, he sat down to eat at a makeshift outdoor mess. 4 armed commandos sat down with him. He grunted, they grunted, Shimi dug into his lunch. A squad mate of Shimi came over to join them, Professor Tindler, who was then only Private Tindler, not yet a professor, not yet even in possession of a high school degree. He placed the tin cup that he was carrying on the edge of the table, taking care not to spill his tea. Then he took up his gun and shot each of the commandos in the head. They fell quite neatly. The first 2 who had been facing Professor Tindler tipped back off the bench into the sand. The second pair, who had their backs to the professor and were still staring open-mouthed at their dead friends, fell face down, the sound of their skulls hitting the table somehow more violent than the report of the gun. Shocked by the murder of 4 fellow soldiers, Shimi Gezer tackled his friend. To Professor Tindler, who was much bigger than Shimi, the attack was more startling than threatening. Tindler grabbed hold of Shimi's hands while screaming, "Egyptians, Egyptians," in Hebrew. He was stating the same name, the same word about the same people in the same desert that had been used thousands of years before. The main difference, if the old stories are to be believed, was that God no longer raised his own fist in the fight. Professor Tindler quickly managed to contain Shimi in a bear hug. "Egyptian commandos, confused," Tindler said, switching to Yiddish. The enemy joined you for lunch." Shimi listened. Shimi calmed down. Professor Tindler, thinking the matter was settled, let Shimi go. As soon as he did, Shimmy swung wildly. He continued attacking because who cared who those 4 men were? They were people. They were human beings who had sat down at the wrong table for lunch. They were dead people who had not had to die. You could have taken them prisoner, Shimmy yelled. Halt, he screamed in German. That's all, halt. Then with tears streaming and fists flying, Shimmy said, you didn't have to shoot. After sorry, excuse me for one moment. Sorry, we got my pages somewhat askew. How about that? Oh my goodness, sorry about this, folks. Okay, let me resume. Shimmy said you didn't have to shoot. By then, Professor Tindler had had enough. He proceeded to beat Shimmy Gezer. He didn't just defend himself. He didn't just subdue his friend. He flipped Shimmy over, straddled his body, and pounded it down until it was level with the sand. He beat his friend until his friend couldn't take any more beating, and then he beat him some more. Finally, he climbed off Shimmy. He looked up into the hot sun and pushed through the crowd of soldiers who had assembled in the minutes since the Egyptians sat down to their fate. Tindler went off to have a smoke. For those who had come running at the sound of gunfire and found 5 bodies in the sand, it was the consensus that a pummeled Shimmy Gezer looked to be in the worst condition of the bunch. At the fruit and vegetable stand that Shimmy Gezer eventually opened in Jerusalem's Mahain Yehuda market, his son, little Edgar, asked about the story of Professor Tindler again and again. From the time he was 6, Edgar had worked the Dukan at his father's side whenever he wasn't in school. At that age, knowing only a child's version of the story, that Tindler had done something in one of the wars that upset Edgar's father, and Edgar's father had jumped on the man, and the man had his father never hesitated to admit this, beat him very badly. Edgar couldn't understand why his father was so nice to the professor now. Reared as he was on the laws of the small family business, Edgar couldn't grasp why he was forbidden to accept a single lira from Tindler. The professor got his vegetables for free. After Edgar weighed the tomatoes and cucumbers, his father would take up the bag, stick in a nice fat eggplant unasked, and pass it over to Professor Tindler. "Ka," his father would say, "take it and wish your wife well." As Edgar turned 9 and 10 and 11, the story began to fill out. He was told about the commandos and the uniforms, about shipping routes and the Suez and the Americans and the British and the French. He learned about the shots to the head. He learned about all the wars his father had fought in, 73, 67, 56, 48. The Shimmy Gezer still stopped short of the one he'd first been swept up in, the war that ran from 1939 to 1945. Edgar's father explained the hazy morality of combat, the split-second decisions, the assessment of threat and response, the nature of percentages and absolutes. Shimmy did his best to make clear to his son that Israelis, in their nation of unfinished borders and unwritten constitution, they were trapped in a gray space called real life. In this gray space, he explained, even absolutes could maintain more than one position, reflect more than one truth. "You too," he said to his son, "may someday face a decision such as Professor Tindler's. May you never know from it." He pointed at the bloody stall across from theirs, pointed at a fish below the mallet, flopping on the bench. "God forbid you should have to live with the consequences of decisions, permanent, external, that will chase you in your head, turning from this side to that, tossing between wrong and right. And absolutely no one but the war widows got their produce free. Quietly and with dignity, so as to cause these women no shame, Edgar's father would send them off with fresh fruit and big bags of vegetables, sometimes for years after their losses. He always took care of the young widows. When they protested, he'd say, "You sacrifice, I sacrifice. All in all, what's a bag of apples? It's all for one country," he'd say. When it came to Professor Tyndall, so clear an answer never came. Now, when Edgar was 12, his father acknowledged the complexities of Tyndall's tale. "Do you want to know why I can care for a man who once beat me? Because to a story, there is context. There is always context in life." "That's it," Edgar said. "That's it." At 13, he was told a different story, because at 13, Edgar was a man. "You know I was in the war," Shimmy said to their son. The way he said it, Edgar knew that it didn't mean 48 or 56, 67 or 73. He did not mean the Jewish wars, in all of which he had fought. He meant the big one, the war that no one but Edgar's... Oh, my goodness. I am so sorry, folks. How did this happen, guys? Sent Edgar across Agrippa Street to get 2 glasses of tea, one for Edgar and one for him. "Hurry," Shimmy said, sending Edgar off with a slap on his behind. Before Edgar had taken a step, his father grabbed his collar and he popped open the register, handing him a brand new 10-shekel bill. "And buy us a nice big bag of seeds from Eisenberg. Tell him to keep the change. You and I, we are going to sit a while." Shimmy took out the second folding chair from behind the register. It would also be the first time that the father and son had ever sat down at the store together. In another role of good business, a customer should always find you standing. Always there's something you can be doing. Sweeping, stacking, polishing apples. The customers will come to a place where there is pride. This is why Professor Tyndall got his tomatoes free. Why the sight of a man who beat Shimmy made his gaze go soft with kindness in the way that it did not when one of the miskinot came by. Why it took on what Edgar called his father's free fruit for young widows' eyes. This is the story that Shimmy told Edgar when he felt that his boy was a man. The first thing Professor Tyndall saw when his death camp was liberated were 2 big, tough American soldiers fainting dead away. The pair, presumably war-hardened, stood before the immense, heretofore unimaginable brutality of modern extermination, frozen, slack-jawed before a mountain of putrid, naked corpses, a hill of men. If you'll excuse me for one moment, let me straighten my cachet here so there's no more of these glitches. A hill of men. And from this pile of broken bodies that had been, prior to the American invasion, set to be burned, a rickety skeletal Tyndall stared back. Professor Tyndall stared and studied, and when he was sure that those soldiers were not Nazi soldiers, he crawled out from the hiding place among the corpses, pushing and shoving those balsa wood arms and legs aside. It was this hill of bodies that had protected Tindler day in and day out. The poor Sonderkommando who dumped the bodies, as well as those who came to cart them to the ovens, knew that the boy was inside. They brought him the crumbs of their crumbs to keep him going. And though it was certain death for these prisoners to protect him, it allowed them a sliver of humanity to their inhuman jobs. This was what Shimmy was trying to explain to his son, that these palest shadows of kindness were enough to keep a dead man alive. When Tindler finally got to his feet, straightening his body out, when the corpse that was Professor Tindler at age 13, your age, came crawling from that nightmare, he looked at the two Yankee soldiers who looked at him and then hit the ground with a thud. Professor Tindler had already seen so much in life that this was not worth even a pause, and so he walked on. He walked on naked through the gates of the camp, walked on until he got some food and some clothes, walked on until he had some shoes and then a coat. He walked on until he had a little bread and a potato in his pocket, a surplus. Soon there was also in that pocket a cigarette, and then a second, a coin, and then a second. Surviving in this way, Tindler walked across borders until he was able to stand straight and tall, until he showed up in his childhood town in a matching suit of clothes with a few bills in his pocket, and in his waistband, a 6-shooter with 5 bullets chambered in order to protect himself during the nights that he slept by the side of the road. Professor Tindler was expecting no surprises, no reunions. He'd seen his mother killed in front of him, his father, his 3 sisters, his grandparents, and after some months in the camp, the 2 boys he knew from back home. But home, that was the thing he held on to. Maybe his house was still there and his bed. Maybe the cow was still giving milk and the goats still chewing garbage and his dog still barking at the chickens as before. And maybe his other family, the nurse at whose breast he had become strong before weakened, her husband who had farmed his father's field, and their son, his age, another 2 years younger, boys with whom he had played like a brother. Maybe this family was still there waiting for him to come home. Tindler could make a new family in that house. He could call every child he might have one day by his dead loved ones' names. The town looked as it had when he left. The streets were his streets, the linden trees and the square taller but laid out as before. And when Tindler turned down the dirt road that led to his gate, he fought to keep himself from running, and he fought to keep himself from crying, because after what he had seen, he knew that to survive in this world, he must always act like a man. So Tindler, he buttoned his coat, and he walked quietly toward the fence, wishing that he had a hat to take off as he passed through the gate, just the way a man of the house would when coming home to what was his. When he saw her in the yard, when he saw Fanushka, his nurse, their maid, the tears came anyway. Tindler popped a precious button from his coat as he ran to her and threw himself into her arms, and he cried for the first time since the trains. With her husband at her side, Fanushka said to him, "Welcome home, my son. Welcome home, my child." And we prayed. We lit candles. We dreamed of your return. When they asked, "Are your parents also coming? Are your sisters and grandparents far behind?" And when they asked after all the old neighbors, house by house, Tindler answered, not by metaphor and not by insinuation. When he knew the fate, he stated it as it was: beaten or starved, shot, cut in half, the front of the head caved in. All this he related without feeling, matters each of fact. All this he shared before venturing a step through his front door. And looking through that open door, Tindler decided that he would live with these people as family until he had a family of his own. He would grow old in this house, free to be free. He would gate himself up again, but it would be his gate, his lock, his world. A hand on his hand pulled him from his reverie. It was Fenushka talking, a sad smile on her face. "Time to fatten you up," she said. "A feast for first dinner." And she grabbed the chicken at her feet and twisted its neck right there in the yard. "Come in," she said, while the animal twitched. "The master of the house has returned." "Just as you left it," she said. "Only a few things that were ours." Tindler stepped inside. It was exactly as he remembered it. The table, the chairs, except all that was personal was gone. Fenushka's two sons came in, and Tindler understood what time had done. These boys, fed and housed, warmed and loved, were fully twice his size. He felt then something he had never known in the camps, a civilized emotion that would have served no use. Tindler felt ashamed. He turned red. He clenched his jaw tight and felt his gums bleeding into his mouth. "You have to understand," Edgar's father said to his son. "These boys, his brothers, they were now twice his size and strangers to him." The boys prodded and shook hands with Tindler. They did not know him anymore. "Still, it's a nice story," Edgar said. "Sad, but also happy. He makes it home to a home. It's what you always say, survival, that's what matters. Surviving to start again." Edgar's father held up a sunflower seed, thinking about this. He cracked it between his front teeth. "So they are all making dinner for Professor Tindler," he said. "He is sitting on the kitchen floor, legs crossed, as he did when he was a boy, and he is watching happily, drinking a glass of goat's milk, still warm. Then the father goes out to slaughter that goat. A feast for dinner," he says. "A chicken's not enough." Professor Tindler, who has not had meat in years, looks at him, and the father, running a nail along the knife, says, "I remember the kosher way." Tindler was so happy that he could not bear it, so happy and so sad. And with a cup of warm milk and the warm feeling, Tindler had to pee. He didn't want to move now that he was there with his other mother and resting on her shoulder a baby sister, a year and a half old and one curl on the head. A little girl, fat and happy, fat in the ankle, fat in the wrist. Professor Tindler rushed out at the last second, out of the warm kitchen, out from under his roof. Professor Tindler, a man whom other men had tried to turn into an animal, did not race to the outhouse. Didn't cross his mind. He stood right under the kitchen window to smell the kitchen smells, to stay close, and he took a piss. Over the sound of the stream, he heard his nurse lamenting. He knew what she must be lamenting, the Tindler family destroyed. He listened to what she was saying, and he heard, "He will take everything," is what she said. "He will take it all from us. Our house, our field. He'll snatch away all we've built and protected, everything that has been for so long, ours." There outside the window, pissing and listening, and also disassociating, as Professor Tindler would call it, although he did not yet then have the word, he knew only that he was watching himself from above, that he could see himself feeling all the disappointment as he felt it, until he was keenly and wildly aware that he had felt nothing in all those years. He felt nothing when his father and mother were shot, felt nothing while in the camps, nothing, in fact, from the moment he was driven from his home to the moment he returned. In that instant, Tindler's guilt was sharper than any sensation he had ever known. And here, in response to his precocious son, Shimmy said, "Yes, Yes, of course it was about survival. Tindler's way of coping. Of course he'd been feeling all along. But Tindler, a boy who had stepped over his mother's body and kept walking, had for those peasants opened up. It was right then Professor Tindler later told Shimmy he had become a philosopher. He will steal it away, Fenushka said, everything. He has come for our lives. And her son, whom Tindler had considered a brother, said no. And Tindler's other almost brother said, no. We will eat, Fenushka said. We will celebrate, and when he sleeps, we will kill him. To one of the sons, she said, go, tell your father to keep that knife sharp. To the other, she said, you get to sleep early and you get up early before you grab that first tit on the cow. I want his throat slit. Ours, not to be taken away. Tindler ran, not toward the street, but back toward the outhouse, in time to turn around as the kitchen door flew open, in time to smile at the younger brother on his way to find his father, in time for Tindler to be heading back the right way. Do you want to hear what was shared at such a dinner? Shimmy asked his son. The memories roused and oaths sworn? There was wine, I know. Drink, drink, the mother said. There was the chicken and a pot of goat stew, and in a time of great deprivation, there was also sugar for the tea. At this, Shimmy pointed at the bounty of their stand, and as if nothing, next to the baby's basket on the kitchen floor sat a basket of apples. Tindler hadn't eaten an apple in who knows how long. Tindler brought the basket to the table. The family laughed as he peeled the apples with a knife, first eating the peels, then the flesh, and savoring even the seeds and the cores. It was a celebration, a joyous night, so much so that Professor Tindler could not by its end, belly distended, eyes crossed with drink, believe what he knew to have been said. There were hugs and there were kisses, and Tindler, the master of the house, was given his parents' bedroom upstairs, the two boys across the hall, and below, in the kitchen, it will be the warmest, slept the mother and the father and the fat-ankled girl. Sleep well, Fenushka said. Welcome home, my son. And sweetly she kissed Tindler on both eyes. Tindler climbed the stairs, he took off his suit and went to bed. And that was where he was when Fenushka popped through the door and asked him if he was warm enough, if he needed a lamp by which to read. No, thank you, he said. So formal? No thanks necessary, Fenushka said. Only, yes, mother. No, mother. My poor reclaimed orphan son. No light, mother, Tindler said, and Fenushka closed the door. Tindler got out of bed. He put on his suit. Once again, without any shame for his actions, Tindler searched the room for anything of value, robbing his own home. Then he waited. He waited until the house had settled into itself, the last creak slipping from the floorboards as the walls pushed back against the wind. He waited until his mother, his Fenushka, must surely sleep, until a brother intent on staying up for the night, a brother who had never once fought for his life, convinced himself that it would be all right to close his eyes. Tindler waited until he too had to sleep. And that's when he tied the laces of his shoes together, hung them over his shoulder. That's when he took his pillow with one hand and with the other quietly cocked his gun. Then, with goose feathers flying, Tindler moved through the house, a bullet for each brother, one for the father and one for the mother. Tindler fired until he found himself standing in the warmth of the kitchen, one bullet left to protect him on the nights when he would sleep by the side of the road. That last bullet Tindler left in the fat baby girl because he did not know from mercy and did not need to leave another of that family to grow to kill him at some future time. He murdered them, Edgar said. A murderer? No, his father told him. There was no such notion at the time. Even so, it is murder, Edgar said. If it is, it's only fair. They killed him first. It was his right. But you always say context. But the baby, the girl. The baby is hardest, I admit, but these are questions for the philosopher. These are the theoretical instances put into flesh and blood. But it's not a question. These people, they are not the ones who murdered his family. They were coming for him that night. He could have escaped. He could have run for the gate when he overheard. He didn't need to race back toward the outhouse, race to face the brother as he came the other way. Maybe there was no more running in him. Anyway, do you understand? An eye for an eye? Can you imagine a broader meaning of self-defense? You always forgive him, Edgar said. You suffered the same things, but you weren't that way. You would not have done what he did. It's hard to know what a person would and wouldn't do in any specific instance. And you, spoiled child, apply the rules of civilization to a boy who had only its opposite. Maybe the fault for those deaths lies in a system designed for the killing of Tindlers that failed to do its job. An error, a slip that allowed a Tindler no longer fit back home in the world. Is that what you think? It's what I ask. And I ask you, my Edgar, what would you have done if you were Tindler that night? Not kill? Then you die. Only the grown-ups. But it was a boy who was sent to cut Tindler's throat. How about killing only those who would do harm? Still it's murder. Still it's killing people who have yet to act. Murdering them in their sleep? I guess, Edgar said. I can see how they deserved it. The four, how I might, if I were him, have killed them? Shimmy shook his head, looking sad. And whoever are we, my son, to decide who should die? It was on that day that Edgar Gezer became a philosopher himself, not in the manner of Professor Tindler, who taught theories up at the university on the mountain, but like his father, practical and concrete. Edgar would not finish high school or go to college, and except for his 3 years in the army, he would spend his life happily working the stand in the shuck. He'd stack the fruit into pyramids and contemplate weighty questions with a seriousness of thought. And when there were answers, Edgar would try employing them to make for himself and others, in whatever small way, a better life. It was on that day, too, that Edgar decided Professor Tindler was both a murderer and at the same time a miskin. He believed he understood how and why Professor Tindler had come to kill that peasant family, and how men sent to battle in uniform, even in the same uniform, would find no mercy at his hand. Edgar also, he came to see how Tindler's story could just as easily ended for Professor Tindler that first night back in his parents' room, in his parents' bed, a gun with 4 bullets held in a suicide's hand. How the first bullet Tindler ever fired might have been into his own head. Still, every Friday, Edgar packed up Tindler's fruit and vegetables, and in that bag, Edgar would add, when he had them, a pineapple or a few fat mangoes dripping honey. Handing it to Tindler, Edgar would say, "Cock, Professor, take it." This even after his father had died. Thank you for listening.
The Reader by Nathan Englander. He sits on a box of books in a storage room piled high with such boxes and remembers the old days, as he does every night on the road. A boy by the name of Todd pops in with a cup of coffee. He's younger than the author. Everyone's so mumuch younger now. It's instant, Todd says, handing over the cup. I hope that's okay. The machine, the barista, it's already shut down. Instant's fine, author says, and takes a sip to prove it. This night, this is City 6 or City 8. It is the end of another day of authors driving around only to find an empty bookshop. Often the stores didn't even have the books that were ordered, let alone an audience to buy them. Author is not ungrateful. The life he'd led, the writing life, it had been beyond his wildest dreams. He'd been treated generously over the years, touted and well received. Still, author had put everything he had into this latest novel. Not just emotion, not just all he'd got in the gumption sort of way, but literally all he had. All his time, all his money, a hunk of his life. Of course, this is what every book had asked him, that he forgo all distraction and every comfort, that he simply put his head down and work. But some decades are more delicate than others, and from this one, he'd lifted his eyes up and discovered that he was old. Author turns around to find Todd still standing there, observing him in his reverie. The boy pulls a handful of creamers from his pocket. He holds the little thimbles out in his palm, reaching right up to the author's chin, as if author were an old goat at a petting zoo. No, thank you, author says, turning away. Intolerant, he says, to lactose, among other things. The last time author read at this store, the barista had not gone home, the staff had not gone home, and the author hadn't drunk coffee. The owner poured whiskey while chasing her starry-eyed workers away. Still, they rushed into the storeroom excitedly to say, "We don't know where to put the people, the audience. They're lined up outside the door." Tonight, there is no one, and Todd peers out into the store one final time to check that it's so. "Let's give it 5 minutes," he says, unpinning his name tag. Then he takes out a phone and his thumbs start flying. Author wants to tell the boy certain things. He wants to say, 12 years. 12 years on a book. Is that now half your life, young man? He wants to tell Todd. One must stand by one's story. It's the same commitment the liar must make. But here it's about sticking by the truth. In a sudden display of eagerness, author offers to sign stock. Can't return them, Todd says. The distributors' signatures they consider, and here Todd looks up from texting. He has started a sentence he doesn't want to finish. Damaged, author says, doing it for him. Todd nods. And then the thumbs, they are on the move. That you haven't heard of author, that any recognition you may once have had is beyond recalling, and author, even in his own estimation, is no longer worth naming. This doesn't take away from what was. It does not diminish the fine books he wrote, does not take away from the countless copies bought and read, beloved books, maybe one signed right to you, the volume itself fallen behind your shelves or your parents, or maybe it is, yes, your grandparents' book, packed away, molding in the basement, with silverfish eating their way through. At his height, the head of the New York Public Library had waited for author on the front steps of that venerable institution, a patrician man. The librarian stood rigid in the rain between his two sleeping lions, simply to show his respect for author, coming there to perform. And then author, he took on a tour of the great halls, insistent on exposing him to the wonders of their collection. This is the cane Virginia Woolf left on the banks of the river when she waded into the waters, the librarian said, pockets full of stones. He laid this relic in author's hand for a moment before leading him back down below the basin of the old Manhattan Reservoir, floor after floor, into the stacks that run deep below Bryant Park. There, the librarian turned a giant nickel wheel, parting shelves like the sea, and said, "These are the best sellers of the 19th century, where we keep your brothers and sisters, the authors who held your esteemed position 100 years ago." Author went to look. Author expected to find the books he cherished from that time. "Is this," Author said. Yes, yes, the librarian said, beaming. "The giants of the era." Author looked again. The spines unfamiliar. Bloomingdale Row. "To the hills, boys. Capshaw is rough, and something with the unfortunate moniker Scuttledy-Doo." Author's eyes bounced around the shelves, picking up speed until they were near rolling in his head. He fought off a panic. Author had not heard of a one. "Tastes change," the librarian said. "Isn't it fascinating how much?" Author had buried the moment away. He'd left it where it sat, deep down below the park, and only now does it come rushing back all these years later, as Author leaves Todd in the storeroom and his ruined career behind. Author says thanks to the boy. Author says goodbye. And Todd doesn't understand that this goodbye is not just to him and his store and this town, but it's Author's goodbye to the whole fucking thing. This last book, Author had typed nearly all of it standing up, fighting an aching back and clacking away at his keyboard with arthritic, rope-knuckled fingers. This is how he now worked, spring gone from his system, bone rubbing against bone. "If you hit the latch thing, it'll lock behind you," is what Todd yells out from the storeroom. Author hears this as he heads for the front door, thinking that this is what it's come to. The boy in the back on his phone, wholly unconcerned that someone might already be inside loading up on the great treasures of literature and robbing the store. Author skirts the 5 empty rows of 5 chairs horseshoed to give the impression of a decent crowd, were they to fill. He keeps his eyes down so as not to see the staff choices or best sellers, so as not to catch reader favorites or the discount stickers next to the embossed foil prizes awarded to the writers he used to know. Author is half out the door when he hears a different voice calling, "Author!" the voice calls, and sharper, more demanding, "Writer!" says, "Writer! You came here to read." In the empty store, in those empty chairs, sits, invisible until he speaks, one man. He is small, much smaller than the author, who is not big. He is considerably older, which Author thinks must make him at least 110. The man's scale is pale, vitamin-starved. His face hangs loose on his head. Shoved into his mouth like a doorstop is a set of big white teeth that surely sit in a glass by night. The only thing with any life left in it is the hair, boot polished black. This, Author can't take his eyes off it. It isn't like those choppers. The hair seems real, vibrant, and undyed. Were Author ever to write again, the hair would be the detail. He'd write of a drawn old man, shrunk inside his clothes, face melting like wax, and this healthy shock of black hair. "You came to read," the man says. "I came to read," Author says. The man stands there, looking expectant. Author pretends to misread the cue he is receiving. He feigns impatience. And when the man continues to hold his ground, Author breaks, openly despairing, his voice choked with all the hurt of that night. "A dozen years," Author says, "day in and day out, writing all the time. You do not know how many pencils it takes just for the drafting," he says. "Boxes and boxes of pencils. Now look," Author says, I'm asking you, take a look." The old man joins the author in surveying the empty room. "Call it a night, shall we?" Author says. "Yes, let's just call it a career and go home." The old man, at first invisible himself, now produces a copy of the author's book, which had been invisible in his hand. It is well worn in a good way. It looks, in fact, Bible soft, a hardcover read so much that it curls in his grip. There's an investment from me too, the man says. A drink, author says. Wouldn't that be better, more personal? Wouldn't you rather maybe a meal? I'd rather you read. That's what I came for. They stare at each other, study faces. An author, he shakes his head as he hears himself speaking. Something short, he says, giving in to this ancient man. It's not for me to dictate, the old man says. If it's one word, then one word. The contract, a social contract, says if I come, you read. It does, doesn't it? Author says, offering a hand and leading the little man to the front row. Author takes a seat himself, angling the chair farther into the horseshoe, and takes up his book to read. No, the little man says, the podium. What? The podium? We are two, author says. The old man looks back blank. As audience, author says, you are one. He holds up a finger to illustrate. Dignity, a great author. I am. You are a great author, a mighty author. 1 or 1 million come to see you, still from the podium. Read out, read strong. Now author's first impression seems rash. Author no longer thinks that the old man seems so crazy anymore, and he is ashamed not to think it because he knows why he no longer thinks it. Author takes his place at the lectern and opens his book. He gives the same introduction he'd give to 1 or 1 million, the same personal, heartfelt warm-up author used to reserve for the big halls. He remembers a night in Seattle, remembers tripping over the cables running from a TV truck into the theater as he made his way backstage. There, a woman in a headset pulled back the curtain for author and said, for a moment, took hold of his arm. Remember to raise your eyes to the balcony, is what she said. You can't see, but they're there. Author reads his heart out for this lone man. He reads so hard, his voice booming, the feel of story told overtaking him, the rhythm of the sentences running through him, that it puts tears in the author's eyes, tears that he lets fall, so that it is now from memory that he reads, turning the pages while the letters swim. It's in the midst of this reverie that he does not, for who knows how long, notice Todd standing there, staring back and forth between the author and the man, a strange thump emanating from him. Todd is trying to distract author thinks, trying to take away from this lovely moment. Why else would this deep bass be coming from? Author posits that this is maybe some kind of anger radiating off Todd, and then pulled back to this world, focusing, he understands that the pulse comes from a pair of headphones clamped like hubcaps around Todd's head. Author, soaring still, reads on. Driving in darkness toward the next distant city, author knows that what he just experienced was a gift. Really, how much richer would a writing life be than finding, even for one night, one true reader? Author rolls this thought around in his brain, sucking on it like a sweet, sticky lozenge. He thinks this thought right down to nothing as he barrels along I-80, pulling right at the right wheel, his car buffeted by the wind. When the check engine light pops up, glowing on his dashboard, author sees it simply as another small test in the life of the true artist. Check engine, check author, drive on. It does not last long, this feeling. It does not last a full 24 hours before author feels ashamed and embarrassed for having driven so far. Author finds himself standing alongside a narrow woman, her wrists girded in copper bangles, as if suited up for some obscure form of war. All author can think is, Who will she fight in this empty store? Who will even bother to come attacking? The woman is talking to author as she lines up a row of tiny point-of-purchase books. It must be a shock for the once-a-decade novelist, she says, startling to see how much things have changed. Yes, yes, author says. A book every 10 years, it's like being a cicada. You spend all that time underground, busy staying alive, and when you finally burrow your way back out, you never know what world you'll find. The woman waves off the whole situation, and the motion sends the bangles scuttling along her arm, giving off a tinny ring. 16 weeks and 3 days from now, this place belongs to CBS. Author doesn't know what to say to this, and so he says, soap, and then pointing at his head, Q-tips. Clears his throat. Some things will always be in need. The woman considers, and while she does, author takes the opportunity to nod in thanks and head for the parking lot door. That's when he hears it. Author! The writer calls. Writer, where do you go? Author stops, blinks, an ear cocked toward the room. Author stands with the doorknob in his hand as if he's just heard his own bird call. Writer, always running, a reading tonight. Before author answers, it's the store owner speaking, her voice enough to knock the little man down. No reading, she says, canceled. Canceled? Why? The old man says, canceled how? He looks at him quizzical. No one came. Someone came, he says. He's not referring to himself. The author came. Look right there. Can you see? He holds the door open, letting in the cold. Not worth it, the lady says. No offense, but the time for the reading has come and gone. Yes, offense, the old man says. And then he's off rhapsodizing, singing author's praises. Author does not take it personally. That is, he does not hear the kindnesses as in reference to him. What he hears from this ancient man is a passion for books themselves. From someone bitten by the written word, author hears what he hears as fellow reader, and author remembers. It was the story of my dovecote. It was Bobble, read to him by his mother. She'd sat by the side of his childhood bed and read the story to author in Russian. This was back in the days when the language whispered at his bedside still held meaning in author's ears. And look at him now, a lifetime later, and he can still see the whole story as if he himself had lived it. For author, it has remained as vivid as it was upon its first telling, while the Russian was all of it gone. When his mother had finished reading, author had asked her if the story was for him. He didn't mean it as metaphor or exaggeration. He was asking sincerely a little boy's question. Had Mr. Bobble composed the story for author to hear? His mother, having read him a tale too sad, too dark for a boy so young, had tousled his hair and kissed his head and said, of course, written for you alone, my son. Author as a child was amazed and overjoyed and filled with wonder. Somewhere a writer had put something out into the world and put it out there for author alone to find. It was an intimacy as real as a friendship. Author looks over at his reader, talking to the bangle-armed woman cajoling. Here was author's crackpot, author's nutcase, and also author's audience, this ancient man with his shoe-polish hair and cataracts, thick as nails through which he reads, somehow drives. The bookstore lady relents and author doesn't fight it. He is now truly touched by this man's dedication, here to see him a second night. Author reads his heart out for the old man, and when author is done, a chastened bookstore lady approaches with a novel that author humbly signs. It is not for the shop. It's an inscription requested, a book personalized and then returned to its owner. She clasps it to her chest, shielding it behind those bangled arms. Author is truly thankful for his champion, his upholder. This is what he tells himself when he finds his one loyal reader wearing a yarmulke, sitting front row at the JCC in St. Paul. In a yarmulke himself, Author is so grateful for this man who sustains him, who preserves him, who does not turn his back in hard times against him, that the mantra turns into a little prayer. Author recites this from his dais, comes out of his mouth, a poem. The old man looks thrilled, teeth and hair shining, as he listens to a private devotion that's nearly drowned out by the din of evening league basketball blowing through a retractable wall. Afterward, he produces a crumpled handwritten schedule with the author's next dates. Yes, a lovely night, this, the old man says, carefree, perusing. But every gift and every blessing have a place where they curdle and turn. This man comes to see him at an empty Brookline Booksmith, an empty Three Lives, an empty Politics and Prose. In Kansas City, when a pair of drunks stumbles in mid-reading to suck up the free wine, Author slams his book shut only to hear the cry from his audience of one, "Author, read on!" Read on, yes, but for how long? Author is a man surviving on memory and the fumes of prestige. He addresses this to his reader, forever at his heels in a quaint Pueblo-inspired bookshop in Alamosa. This book, Author says, it's not a novel, it's a tombstone. Why not just hammer it in the ground above my head? My name's already on the front. A mistake to make such a request, the reader says. Never die soon. Too soon? Look at me. I'm the duck hanging too long on its hook in the window, past eating. The only difference? Yes, the reader says. What is the difference between you and the duck on the hook? The duck, Author says, at least knows when it's time to be dead. The old man stares at Author, considering. My father, he says, hung himself at 97 years old. He couldn't take it any longer. That's what he said in his note. He didn't want to face living anymore. Sorry to hear that. I wish he'd spoken to me, the old man says. I'd have told him, 97? No need for such drastic action, Father. Patience, just give it a little time. Forgive the Author his relentless commitment. Forgive him his belief that even if the next city promises nothing more than this one old man, still it's his obligation to drive on. A writer never knows if perseverance is his terrible weakness or his greatest strength. And with all those headlights floating divided in his rearview mirror, Author can never tell which belong to his reader, which pair is his beacon, a North Star, split, cast back, guiding him on. The two arrive at a Denver bookstore, which is now half marijuana dispensary. A scheme, the owner says while dusting a beloved volume, to use one drug to pay for another. After an empty but for his lone reader reading, it's this man, flush with cash and good living, who tells Author to take any book he wants for his troubles, a gift of the store. Bobble, Author says, surprising himself. The early stories, he'd not let himself read them since he was a boy. From Denver, Author crosses the Rockies toward the Pacific, with his reader ever mindful of the speed limit and hot pursuit. At Salt Lake City, Author hangs a northerly right and drives up to Vancouver through 3 days of rain. After reading for his reader in that lush city, Author turns his car toward the next bookstore, making his way back down the West Coast. The sun is with him this time, and Author drives with an arm stuck out the window, cooking his left side to a burn. At a gas station just north of Seattle, Author fills his tank with the last of the money he has. He is so strapped for cash that a few miles farther on, he stops at a church-run stand by the side of the road. There, he sells the bauble he'd only just been given for $1. Watches the lady drop it into a box after marking it for $2. The stories, he tells her, are just the way I remember. Pulling into Seattle, a city where author was once truly renowned, he knows literally and figuratively how long he's been laid. That his old friend, the buyer for Elliott Bay Books, has arranged to host author for a reading is an act of charity so undisguised, it leaves him humbled enough to receive another. Eyes down, author enters the Come Unto Me mission across the street from the bookshop, eats a bowl of soup, his first meal of the day. Inside the bookshop, author gives his name to the pierced-nosed clerk behind the counter. He tells him, without any emotion, that his reading is downstairs. Author is crestfallen as he approaches the basement steps. Then he hears the noise, and his heart is set aflutter at the sound of a reception in full swing. The energy, he can feel it in his feet through the floorboards. Author stops himself from taking the stairs 2 at a time. There is indeed a crowd assembled when he reaches the basement. They are coffee drinkers filling a bookstore cafe. Author asks the barista, and she points. The reading is in a tiny room beyond. How the noise had confused author, how it had filled him with glee. When the book buyer shows up, he finds author waiting in the little room, and the years wash away. All that time, nothing but a blink when there's warmth between two people. They hug, and the buyer says, "You look good, just the same." Before the emptiness of the room sours the moment, the buyer tackles its head on. "I'm really sorry," he says. "It's a great book. The no-show, it's not you, it's us. It's been slow this season, numbers are down." "It's all right," author says. "The whole country is for me a desert, empty rooms from sea to shining sea." It feels so good to tell it to this man who knew how it once was, who'd orchestrated author's glorious sellout night a dozen years before, and yet who, with grace, now has acknowledged what is, not like his reader, not like his shadow drowning him in faith. Author says, "You know what? Let's not even wait. How about, for old time's sake, let's just get a drink, you and me?" Buyer considers and throws an arm over author's shoulder. "Sure, I'd love that," he says. He drops his arm and slides through the cafe towards the stairs with the author, wistful, behind. As they climb, author hears it. It's surprised he does with the music and the chatter, but there it is from deep in the mix of the cafe. "Author! Writer! It's time to start!" What he hears. "Hello, writer! Where do you go?" The book buyer half hears it himself, enough to pause, banister in hand. Author won't have it. He keeps climbing, driving the buyer on, and author's old man, too slow to catch up and all the stairs before him, screams from below with all he's got. "Hey, writer!" he calls, and then, "Hey, bookstore man, a customer down here, the writer must read." This, the book buyer doesn't miss. "If you listen to that," he says, "you're public calling." Before he says more, the author, hangdog, turns and heads downstairs. The reading is starting, but no one from the cafe comes in. Conversations continue, the music blares. It takes no small effort on the part of the buyer to convince the barista to turn the sound system down. There is, author hears it, a low round of booze. The old man sits in the front row in the tiny 3-row back room. Small as it is, there's still a plywood stage, a foot high and not much deeper, with a little lectern perched at an angle from which the author will read. The emotion on author's face is clear, and the buyer waits for him to compose himself, though it's quickly becoming obvious that the author's despair is anything but subsiding. It seems to be frothing into a rage aimed inexplicably at the frail little man. "Buddy," the buyer says, trying to steer author to the stage, "how about you just give me the 5 minutes and then we'll grab us a drink?" The buyer, without even noticing, is kneading author's shoulders and patting his back as if coaxing him into the ring. Yes, 5 minutes, the old man says. Now up on that stage. Time to start. Sets the author off. Stalker, author screams. Patron, do you understand how crazy it is, the author says. Do you understand how crazy it is, you? Author stands silent, visibly shaking. The old man turns to the buyer, assuming he's taken the author's side. Tell me, why is the artist a romantic for surviving on a glimmer of hope? Why not the same for the reader? Why is my commitment a weaker thing? I came, the old man says. He reads. The author, as if the two men were all alone in the world, screams back, I won't! Devil! Devilish! Devilish old man! The old man is laughing. To the buyer, he says, he'll read, you'll see. And to the author, adamant, demanding, tell this bookman so he understands. Tell him what is really at stake in your heart and mind. Author does not want to cry. Once he can feel his eyes wet and goes as far as tipping his head back, praying a tear won't fall. What? What? The old man says, a hand cupped to his ear. Author says, it will not allowed sound so good. Tell him, the old man yells, pointing to the buyer. Tell him why a man like you does what he does. I write, author says, face twisted into a wince, to touch people in the way that I, as a reader, have been touched. And here his expression unwinds. And if I were still any good at all, it wouldn't be just you two here listening. Failure, I admit it. Now you, he says to the old man, admit it too. Self-pity, a lament of an aging beauty queen. No, the reader says, I won't admit failure for a book written for the ages. Two men stand there facing each other, author now openly weeping. They are caught in a moment so large and so raw that they do not notice that the cell phone ringers have gone silent and the coffee machine has lost its terrible hiss, that the chatter is missing from the next room as the whole of that coffee shop, drawn by the screaming, now crowds around the doorway, watching their fight. It's the woman from behind the counter, pierced and tatted and hair-streaked blue. Come on, read, she says. Her call immediately backed up by another. Get up there, someone yells, and another screams. Hey, one old guy, get the other old guy his due. Sizable audience is forming. Plunged up with all his blubbering and sniffling, author takes his book and a stiff-kneed step up to the stage. He will read tonight to a mob. Oh no, the old man yells, not this way. He gets behind the door, and with feet dug in, he pushes hard against it, attempting to close it on the assembled hipsters who do not immediately retreat. Out! He yells, out, out, stylish young people. The old man frees a hand and points at author on stage so only the pointing hand is visible to those on the cafe side of the door. This man is a legend, not a trained cat from a Russian circus. You listen for the right reasons. This is not a monkey who will ride a dog for a show. And when the old man says Russian, author watching from the stage thinks Russian and remembers the story of a promised dovecote. He sees a pair of Baubles' bloody birds broken at his feet. The old man keeps on with his pushing until the door is shut. During the scuffle, his black hair has somehow flipped in the wrong direction, its part reversed. That miraculous hair, which author was sure was left untouched by time, reveals itself to be a separate color underneath. It is the sick yellow of straw. Author's reader for once looks his properly petrified age, and the reader, somehow sensing this, hurriedly flips his hair back to where it belongs. His hand, so much worse than author's, spills over with tremors. Me and him, the old man says to author while pulling the bookseller toward him. Why not read for this nice pair who both know and understand? Author opens his novel to a random page, symbolic. He gets ready to read from memory, to recite for his relentless pursuer. He will read the old man's favorite part. Author starts in, unintelligible, with the echoes of all his hemming and crying and a rattle to his voice. He has not read 2 lines when he stops. He puts a hand up to signal that he's only pausing, and author pulls from his back pocket a small, soft notebook, its spiral gone. It is where author secretly, involuntarily, and against better judgment, makes his endless notes. It is where he sketches a new book for which no one will wait, and of which no one will hear. Pulling the rubber band off, he knows his reader won't live to see it, even if author soldiers on to see it done. Something new I've been working on, author says, and the old man nods, full of respect. And the bookseller, who has been standing until now, nods as well, taking a seat at the reader's side. And author, who has played bigger and larger, who has, under all the pressure in the world, executed such things with aplomb, wipes his nose on his sleeve, takes a deep breath, and, leaning down close to the little book, reads on with all he's got. Author reads for Seattle. It's always been his city. He reads for the buyer, who has always believed. Author reads one more time to his old man. He smiles at his reader and reads on through the tears. Author reads on, and author reads on. The end.
Oh, thank you guys so much. Perseverance. You can't beat it, can you? I appreciate you so much.
Yeah.
And I appreciate Nathan Englander so much. And I appreciate Thunder River Theater quite a lot myself as well. Next month, we'll be looking forward to hearing some stories by the great Irish writer Frank O'Connor about men being only boys grown tall, featuring the voices of Ed Foran and Franz Alderfer. Be safe, be good to yourselves, listen to everybody, and appreciate good literature. Thank you all. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, guys.